On a suffocating night in September 1851, deep within the treacherous marshlands of Missouri's river country, a pursuit reached its conclusion in a manner nobody could have predicted. 4 white men lay lifeless across 2 brutal weeks of relentless tracking, each one eliminated in isolation, each one dying with the full understanding of precisely why retribution had located them. The hunter was an enslaved man known as Ghost, a soul who had vanished into the wetlands following the killing of his beloved wife and transformed into something entirely different, a soundless predator who reversed the roles between pursuer and pursued. By the time the authorities grasped what was unfolding, Ghost had evaporated completely, leaving behind only corpses and a dread that would terrorize slaveholders throughout the region for generations to come. This represents the chronicle of how one man's devastation became 4 men's execution, and how the marshlands of Missouri consumed every trace of the most calculated vengeance in the annals of American bondage. Yet everything commenced 6 months earlier, when Ghost still believed survival through compliance was possible, when he still possessed something irreplaceable to protect, when his humanity remained wholly intact. The year 1851 signified an era of merciless expansion throughout Missouri's fertile bottomlands, where hemp and tobacco plantations sprawled across thousands of acres of rich earth. Clay County, positioned along the state's western frontier near the confluence of multiple waterways, had evolved into one of the most profitable zones in the entire border region. The river port at Liberty shipped enormous quantities of hemp rope and tobacco leaf to markets in St. Louis and beyond, generating wealth that constructed imposing brick mansions and purchased hundreds of enslaved souls to cultivate the crops. The Missouri River and its countless tributaries formed an intricate web of channels ideal for commerce, but simultaneously created massive wetland territories where willows grew from standing water, where fog settled like burial shrouds, and where a determined individual could vanish if he understood the terrain sufficiently well. Riverside Estate claimed 2,000 acres along the eastern bank of a major tributary, 12 miles northwest of Liberty proper. Master Edmund Hartwell controlled 93 slaves, establishing him as one of the dominant plantation operators in the county. The main residence stood on elevated ground, a substantial 2-story brick structure with 4 towering columns and an expansive gallery overlooking hemp fields extending toward the distant tree line. Behind the main house, the slave quarters formed a single extended row of crude log structures with packed earth floors and gaps between the planks that admitted winter winds and summer insects. The hemp processing shed stood near the river landing, its mechanical presses crushing thousands of pounds of stalks daily during harvest season. A punishment post stood at the quarter's center, visible from every dwelling, a perpetual reminder of the price of defiance. The social hierarchy at Riverside Estate followed the conventional plantation structure. Master Hartwell rarely engaged directly with field laborers, preferring to maintain separation while extracting maximum productivity. His wife, Margaret Hartwell, supervised the house servants with a distinctive cruelty masked as Christian compassion. The overseer, a brutal man named Caleb Morrison, controlled daily operations with a reputation for savagery that extended beyond Riverside to every plantation in Clay County. 2 drivers, slaves elevated to supervisory roles, enforced Morrison's commands in exchange for marginally improved rations and exemption from field labor. A permanent force of 3 slave patrols called paddy rollers by the enslaved community rode the county roads nightly, authorized to stop, interrogate, flog, or shoot any black person discovered without proper papers. Hemp dominated every dimension of existence at Riverside Estate. Throughout planting season from April through June, slaves labored from first light until darkness preparing soil, planting seeds in exact rows, and praying for adequate moisture. Summer meant endless cultivation, clearing weeds with hoes while the Missouri heat reached temperatures that killed the frail and aged. But harvest season from August through October delivered the harshest conditions. Every slave above age 10 was expected to cut and bundle 150 pounds of hemp stalks daily, with severe beatings for anyone who failed to meet quotas. The processing shed operated ceaselessly, its mechanical thunder a constant accompaniment to exhaustion. Master Hartwell sold his hemp at 18 cents per pound in 1851, producing over $35,000 annually, a fortune constructed entirely on stolen labor and shattered bodies. The political atmosphere in Missouri reflected the border state's intensifying anxiety about slave resistance. Following Denmark Vesey's conspiracy in South Carolina and Nat Turner's uprising in Virginia, With tensions escalating over slavery's extension into Western territories, border states had enacted increasingly draconian regulations. In Missouri, teaching slaves to read or write was illegal, punishable by up to 50 lashes. Slaves could not assemble in groups exceeding 5 without white supervision. Slaves could not possess property, testify in court against white persons, or travel beyond 5 miles from their plantation without written authorization. The penalty for striking a white person was death by hanging. The punishment for attempted escape was up to 75 lashes, branding, or hamstringing, the severing of tendons to prevent running. The punishment for killing a white person was torture, followed by public execution, with the body frequently left displayed for weeks as a warning. The man who would become Ghost was born with a different name, one his mother whispered to him in fragments of the Osage language she had absorbed during her years hiding in the territories before her capture. His master called him Thomas, a biblical name stripped of African heritage, but his mother called him Wanagi, an Osage word meaning spirit or ghost, because he moved with unusual silence even as an infant. He never used that name openly, but he carried it within himself, a secret identity that connected him to something beyond bondage. Thomas was 31 years old in 1851, though plantation records listed him as 28 because Master Hartwell had purchased him at age 17 and estimated his age incorrectly. He stood just under 6 feet tall, unusual height for someone who had survived childhood malnutrition and decades of inadequate nutrition. His body was lean muscle stretched over bone, with shoulders broadened by years of swinging axes and hoisting hemp bales. His skin was deep brown, nearly black in certain illumination, inherited from a father he never knew who had arrived directly from West Africa. His face was angular with pronounced cheekbones and a firm jaw that he kept carefully neutral around white people. His eyes were the most distinctive feature, dark brown and remarkably still, with a quality of patient observation that made overseers uncomfortable. He bore a scar across his left shoulder from a whipping he received at age 15 for making eye contact with Master Hartwell's daughter. Another scar crossed his right forearm where hemp processing machinery had caught him at age 20, nearly severing his hand. He walked with a barely perceptible limp from childhood rickets, but it never impeded his work. Thomas's earliest memories were of his mother's face, though she died when he was 6. She had been born free in West Africa, captured at age 14 during a raid, survived the Middle Passage chained in a slave ship's hold, and was sold at the New Orleans auction block for $800. She remembered everything: her village, her family, her language, her gods, and she transmitted these memories to Thomas through whispered stories late at night when the overseers were intoxicated or sleeping. She taught him that he was not property, that his body might be owned but his soul remained free, that resistance assumed many forms, and patience was itself a weapon. When she died from pneumonia after working in freezing rain for 2 days straight, 6-year-old Thomas made his first promise. He would survive, he would remember, and he would never truly submit. Thomas was sold twice before arriving at Riverside. His first master sold him at age 11 to settle gambling debts. His second master worked him in a lead mine in southeastern Missouri, where he learned to read stone and water, where he learned that underground spaces had rhythms and secrets. His second master sold him to Hartwell because Thomas was too intelligent, too observant, and overseers reported feeling watched. Hartwell purchased him for $700 and assigned him to work as a general laborer and occasional craftsman, a position that allowed Thomas to move around the plantation more freely than field hands, to observe patterns, to learn the rhythms of white men's routines. Thomas's skill with woodworking and repair made him valuable. He could construct anything: cabins, furniture, tools, repairs to hemp processing machinery. This skill meant he entered the main house regularly to fix doors, windows, and furniture. He observed how the master and mistress lived, the luxury built on hemp profits, the casual cruelty disguised as normalcy. He also learned the master's schedule. Hartwell rode to Liberty every Wednesday for business, returned intoxicated most nights by 10 o'clock, slept late every morning, and spent Friday afternoons at neighboring plantations discussing politics and complaining about abolitionists. This information seemed useless at the time. Later, it would prove crucial. Thomas had survived by becoming invisible. He perfected the mask of submission: eyes downcast, voice quiet, body posture deferential. He said yes, master, and no, master, and never displayed emotion. He labored hard enough to avoid punishment, but never so hard that he destroyed his body for their profit. He assisted other slaves when possible, secretly repairing their tools, teaching young men how to meet their quota without permanent injury, sharing his rations with the elderly. The old slaves called him steady, reliable, trustworthy. The young slaves called him patient, wise beyond his years. No one called him dangerous. That would come later, but Thomas's carefully constructed survival strategy depended on having nothing precious to lose. For 30 years, he had succeeded by caring about nothing enough to risk resistance. He had no close friendships that would devastate him if severed by sale. He had no family left alive. He had no possessions worth fighting for. He had adapted to slavery by numbing himself to attachment, by accepting that everything could be taken at any moment, by living in a state of controlled emotional death that made survival possible. Then he met Clara, and everything changed. Clara arrived at Riverside Estate in April 1850, sold by a plantation in Kentucky after her master died, and his estate was liquidated. She was 26 years old, lighter skinned than Thomas due to a white grandfather no one discussed, and beautiful in a way that immediately attracted dangerous attention from Hartwell and Morrison. She had been a house slave in Kentucky, trained in cooking and sewing, which meant Mistress Hartwell claimed her immediately for household work. Clara was intelligent, literate despite laws forbidding it. Her Kentucky mistress had been a Methodist with abolitionist sympathies who secretly taught Clara to read, and she carried herself with a dignity that slavery had not broken. Thomas first saw Clara in May 1850 when he was repairing a kitchen shutter. She was kneading dough, her hands working the mixture with competent strength, her face focused and serious. She glanced up when Thomas entered, and their eyes met for 2 seconds before both looked away, observing the unspoken rule against direct eye contact between male and female slaves in the main house, where mistresses watched for any hint of romance they could punish. But those 2 seconds ignited something Thomas thought he had killed inside himself: hope for human connection, desire for something beyond mere survival, the dangerous possibility of love. They began speaking in stolen moments, a conversation in the tool shed when Clara brought broken kitchen implements for repair, brief exchanges during Sunday afternoons when slaves had a few hours of controlled freedom, whispered words during nighttime when darkness offered slight protection from surveillance. Thomas learned that Clara had been married in Kentucky, that her husband had been sold to a plantation in Arkansas 2 years earlier, that she had been pregnant once and miscarried after a beating from an overseer. Clara learned that Thomas had taught himself to track and hunt in the wetlands, that he knew plants and their properties, that he had never attempted to escape because he had nowhere to run to and no one to run for. They recognized in each other a shared intelligence, a shared exhaustion, a shared need for connection in a system designed to destroy human bonds. By summer 1850, they were in love, though neither spoke the word aloud for months. Love was dangerous for enslaved people. Love gave masters leverage. Love created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. But love also restored humanity that slavery tried to erase. When Thomas held Clara in the darkness of his cabin, when they whispered dreams of freedom they knew were impossible, when they imagined a life where their children could read and own their own labor and walk without fear, they were committing an act of resistance simply by caring about each other. In November 1850, Thomas and Clara were married in a ceremony the slaves called jumping the broom. It had no legal standing, enslaved people could not legally marry, but it had spiritual weight in the slave community. An elderly woman named Aunt Bess, who remembered African traditions and mixed them with Christianity, presided over the ceremony. 15 slaves gathered in the woods at midnight, risking punishment for unauthorized assembly, to witness 2 people claim commitment in a world that denied them every other choice. Thomas and Clara jumped over a broomstick together, an act that symbolized sweeping away the past and beginning a new life. They exchanged no rings. Slaves owned nothing, but they made promises. Thomas promised to protect Clara as much as any enslaved man could protect anyone. Clara promised to stand beside Thomas in whatever came. Both knew these were promises slavery might force them to break. They made them anyway. For 8 months, they built something resembling life. Clara became pregnant in December 1850, a development that brought joy and terror in equal measure. A child meant hope for the future, but also another soul born into bondage, another hostage to master's whims, another vulnerability. Thomas began planning for a future he had never imagined. He secretly carved a cradle from oak wood. He stored extra food when possible. He dreamed of holding his son or daughter and telling them they were loved. Clara sang spirituals while working, songs that sounded like religious submission but contained coded messages about freedom and resistance that slaves understood and masters dismissed. They had Sundays together, precious hours when they could pretend they were simply a married couple expecting a child rather than property that could be separated or destroyed at any moment. But their happiness made them visible, and visibility was dangerous. Master Hartwell noticed Clara with increasing interest. A pregnant slave represented future property. A child born on his plantation belonged to him, worth $350 if sold at age 10. But pregnancy did not stop masters from exercising what they considered their rights over enslaved women's bodies. Hartwell had a history of raping house slaves, justified through pseudoscientific theories that claimed black women were hypersexual, and white men's attention was actually a civilizing influence. He had fathered at least 6 children with enslaved women, children he sold without hesitation because acknowledging them would complicate inheritance and offend his wife. Clara's beauty and growing belly seemed to increase rather than decrease his interest. Overseer Morrison also watched Clara. Morrison was a man who interpreted his authority as license for any cruelty he could imagine. He was 36 years old, scarred from fights, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a hemp processing accident, and known throughout Clay County as a Negro breaker, a specialist in crushing the will of resistant slaves. Plantation owners hired Morrison when they had slaves who were unmanageable, and he would torture them with methodical creativity until they submitted or died. He drank heavily, fought constantly, and raped enslaved women as casually as he whipped field hands. He had been watching Clara since her arrival, and Thomas's marriage to her represented a challenge to Morrison's sense of dominion. The other constant threats were the paddy rollers, the slave patrol that rode Clay County's roads enforcing the system's violence. 3 men composed the primary patrol: Isaac Dawson, a small farmer with 4 slaves of his own who patrolled to supplement his income; Benjamin Kirby, a plantation owner's son who enjoyed hunting black people more than hunting animals; and Samuel Reed, the patrol leader, a cold professional who saw enslaved people as livestock to be controlled through terror. These men earned $3 per captured runaway, plus bonuses for shooting fugitives who resisted. They rode in pairs or groups armed with pistols, whips, and authority to stop any black person for any reason. Every slave in Clay County knew their names, their horses, their habits, and every slave feared them. Thomas watched all of them. In the 8 months of his marriage to Clara, he observed patterns: Hartwell's Wednesday trips to Liberty, Morrison's Friday afternoon drinking sessions with the drivers, the paddy rollers' routes. They circled the county counterclockwise, passing Riverside's boundaries every 4 days around 10 o'clock at night. He noticed that Hartwell was careless when intoxicated, that Morrison slept heavily after drinking, that the paddy rollers separated when tracking multiple reports of suspicious movement. Thomas did not consciously plan anything. He simply observed, filed information away, maintained his mask of submission. But part of him was always calculating, always aware of vulnerabilities, always preparing for a crisis he sensed was inevitable. That crisis arrived on March 12, 1851. The morning began like any other March day at Riverside Estate. Thomas woke before dawn, kissed Clara's forehead. She was 5 months pregnant, her belly grown round, left their cabin to begin work. He was repairing the hemp processing shed's main drive shaft, damaged during the previous harvest season. The work was precise and demanding, requiring his full attention. He labored through the morning, stopping only for a brief midday meal of cornbread and salt pork. The afternoon sun was brutal, temperatures climbing above 80 degrees despite early spring. Sweat soaked through Thomas's shirt as he hammered metal fittings into place, his hands methodical and steady despite the heat. Inside the main house, Clara worked in the kitchen alongside 2 other house slaves, preparing the evening meal. Mistress Hartwell was hosting a dinner party for neighboring plantation owners, which meant elaborate preparations: roasted duck, sweet potatoes, fresh bread, pies made with preserved fruits. Clara's hands were covered in flour as she rolled out pie crusts, her movements efficient despite the weight of pregnancy. The kitchen was stifling, heat from the cooking fire making the room feel like a furnace. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of flour across her dark skin. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Master Hartwell entered the kitchen. He had been drinking since noon, a habit that was worsening as hemp prices fluctuated and debts accumulated. His face was flushed, his movement slightly unsteady, his eyes fixed on Clara with an expression that made the other house slaves suddenly find reasons to leave the room. Clara kept working, her hands trembling slightly as she crimped the edges of a pie crust, her eyes focused downward in the posture of submission that sometimes, not always, protected enslaved women from unwanted attention. Hartwell crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He stood close enough that Clara could smell bourbon on his breath, close enough that his physical presence was a threat. "You've grown quite large," he said, his voice carrying a tone that mixed observation with ownership. "Breeding stock should be bred properly. Can't let good property go to waste." Clara kept her eyes down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, master. Baby coming in 4 months, master." Hartwell's hand reached out and touched her belly, a gesture that violated her body while being framed as examining his property. "Whose child is it?" "Thomas's, master," she said, the name escaping like a prayer. "Thomas. Good bloodlines, strong back on him. Child should be worth $350 at age 10, maybe more if it's a boy." He was calculating profit from her unborn child while standing inches from her pregnant body. This was normal. This was how masters thought. Clara said nothing, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping the rolling pin hard enough that her knuckles paled. Hartwell's hand moved from her belly to her breast, squeezing with casual cruelty. "Pregnancy suits you. Makes these fuller, more pleasing." His other hand gripped her throat, not choking but controlling, tilting her face up to force eye contact. "Look at me when I speak to you." Clara's eyes met his, and in that moment she made a choice that would determine everything that followed. She could submit as she had submitted countless times before, allowing him to rape her while she went somewhere else in her mind. Or she could resist, knowing resistance would mean punishment. She thought of Thomas. She thought of her unborn child. She thought of 26 years of submission that had protected nothing, saved no one, prevented no suffering. "Please don't, master," she whispered. "I'm carrying a child. Your property might harm the baby." It was the most dangerous thing she could have said, using his own logic about property value to argue against his desire. Hartwell's face darkened with rage. His hand around her throat tightened. "You telling me what I can and can't do with my property? You think carrying a pickaninny gives you rights?" "No, master, I just—" Her words cut off as he squeezed harder. "You just nothing." He released her throat and struck her across the face with an open palm, a blow hard enough to spin her sideways into the table. Pie tins clattered to the floor. Flour puffed into the air. Clara caught herself against the table, tasting blood where her lips split against her teeth. Hartwell was breathing hard. Fury and desire mixed in his expression. He grabbed her arm and began dragging her toward the back stairs that led to his private chambers. Clara resisted, pulling back, her feet sliding on the flour-dusted floor. "Please, master, please don't." The kitchen door burst open. Mistress Hartwell stood in the doorway, her face twisted with a rage that had nothing to do with protecting Clara and everything to do with wounded pride. She was 40 years old, aging poorly, watching her husband prefer enslaved women to her bed, and directing her humiliation toward the women rather than her husband. "You whore," she hissed at Clara. "Seducing my husband under my own roof." Clara's voice cracked with desperation. "No, mistress, I didn't." "Lying, too." Mistress Hartwell's voice was cold and precise. "Edmund, this one needs a lesson. She needs to learn her place. And every other slave needs to see what happens to temptresses who forget their property." Master Hartwell released Clara's arm, his desire cooling into calculated cruelty. "You're right, my dear. She does need correction." He turned to the house slaves who had reappeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. "Send for Morrison. Tell him we have a discipline problem that requires his expertise." The words sent ice through Clara's veins. Everyone knew what Morrison's expertise meant. Everyone had heard the screams from the punishment post. Everyone had seen the broken people who survived his attention. She dropped to her knees, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. "Please, mistress, I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything. Please don't." Mistress Hartwell's voice was venomous. "Take her to the post. Make an example. Show everyone what happens to slaves who get above themselves." 2 house slaves, both terrified of being associated with Clara's punishment, grabbed her arms and lifted her to her feet. She struggled, her voice rising to a wail. "Please, I'm pregnant. The baby. Please." They dragged her from the kitchen, through the back door, across the yard toward the quarters where the punishment post stood in the center of the compound, visible to every cabin. Other slaves emerged from fields and workshops drawn by the commotion, gathering in a reluctant audience because not watching meant being accused of sympathy with the victim. Thomas heard the screams before he understood their source. He was at the hemp shed 300 yards from the quarters when Clara's voice cut through the afternoon heat, a sound of pure terror that made his blood freeze. He dropped his hammer and ran, his limp barely slowing him as he sprinted across the hemp field toward the quarters. He emerged from the crop rows to see Clara being tied to the punishment post, her wrists bound above her head, her body positioned so her pregnant belly faced the post, her back exposed. Overseer Morrison was approaching with his favorite whip, an 8-foot leather bullwhip that could strip flesh from bone. He was smiling. He walked slowly, deliberately, drawing out the terror. 40 slaves formed a semicircle around the post, forced to watch, forbidden to show sympathy or look away. Master and Mistress Hartwell stood on the main house gallery, observing their property management. The scene was completely normal for Riverside Estate. This happened regularly. Violence maintained control. Thomas pushed through the crowd of slaves, his mind fractured between civilization and something primal. Every instinct screamed at him to stop this, to protect his wife, to kill anyone who touched her. But 30 years of conditioning, 30 years of watching other men die for resisting, 30 years of calculated survival held him frozen. He had no weapon. He was surrounded by armed white men. Any action would result in his immediate death and do nothing to protect Clara. He clenched his fists hard enough to draw blood from his palms, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on his wife. Clara's voice carried across the quarters, steady despite terror. Thomas, it's okay, I'm okay, don't do anything stupid. Think of the baby. Promise me you'll take care of our baby." She knew. She knew he was considering resistance. She knew it would get him killed. She was thinking of their child even as she faced torture. Thomas wanted to scream, to charge the overseer, to die fighting. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his mask of submission perfectly in place, his soul screaming inside a motionless body. Morrison reached the post and ran his hand down Clara's back, a gesture that was both assessment of where to strike and sexual violation. "Pregnant women need lighter punishment," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't risk Master's property, so we'll make it just 40 lashes instead of the usual 75. Nice and easy." His smile widened. "But we'll make sure each one counts." He stepped back, let the whip uncoil, and took his stance. The crowd went silent. Clara pressed her face against the post, her body tensed. Thomas stopped breathing. The first lash cracked across Clara's back with a sound like a gunshot. Her body jerked, a gasp torn from her throat. The whip left a diagonal line of torn fabric and torn flesh from her left shoulder to her right hip. Blood welled immediately, dark against her lighter skin. Morrison took his time, waiting 10 seconds before the second strike. He was an artist of cruelty, spacing his blows to maximize pain without killing quickly. The second lash crossed the first, creating an X pattern. Clara cried out, her voice breaking. The third lash fell lower across her lower back just above her hips. The fourth lash fell diagonal again, opening new wounds that intersected with old ones. By the 10th lash, Clara's back was a mass of torn flesh, blood streaming down her body, soaking through her dress, dripping into the dirt. Her screams had become continuous, a sound that bypassed thought and struck directly at the most primal parts of human empathy. Thomas watched every second. He counted every lash. His face remained expressionless. Inside, something was breaking. Every blow to his wife's body was a blow to his soul. Every scream carved a wound in his mind that would never heal. He had spent his entire life adapting to slavery, but this, watching the woman he loved tortured while carrying his child, this exceeded his capacity to endure without fracturing. By the 20th lash, Clara's voice had weakened to gasps. Her body hung limply from the ropes, held up only by her bound wrists. Blood covered her back, her hips, the back of her legs. The dirt beneath her feet was dark with blood. Morrison was breathing hard from exertion, but his smile never faded. He was enjoying this. Violence was his vocation. The 25th lash fell across Clara's lower back with enough force that her body swung forward, slamming her pregnant belly against the post. She shrieked, a sound different from the previous screams, a sound of internal injury. Thomas's hands clenched so hard his nails drew blood from his palms. He took one step forward. An elderly slave beside him gripped his arm, held him back, whispered urgently, "Don't. She's telling you don't. Think of the child." The 30th lash. Clara vomited, her body's response to trauma and pain. The 40th lash fell across her shoulders with a crack that echoed off the cabin walls. Morrison stepped back, coiling his whip, breathing hard but satisfied. Clara hung from the post unconscious, her back destroyed, blood pooling in the dirt beneath her. "Cut her down," Master Hartwell called from the gallery. "Put her in the medical cabin. If the baby dies, it dies. If she dies, she dies. Either way, the lesson's been taught." 2 slaves cut Clara's bonds and caught her as she fell. Her body was limp, her breathing shallow. They carried her toward the medical cabin, a rough structure where Aunt Bess treated injuries with herbs and prayers because no white doctor would waste time on enslaved people unless they were particularly valuable. Thomas followed, his movements mechanical, his mind unable to process what he had just witnessed. Inside the medical cabin, Aunt Bess cleaned Clara's wounds with water and salt, a treatment that would prevent infection but caused additional agony. Clara regained consciousness and screamed again as salt touched raw flesh. Thomas held her hand, murmured her name, told her she would survive, lied about everything being okay. Aunt Bess's face was grim as she examined Clara's belly. "Baby still moving," she said quietly, "but she took damage. Can't say if the child will make it." For 2 days, Clara clung to life. Thomas stayed beside her, leaving only when forced to work, returning immediately after. He brought her water, cleaned her wounds, held her hand while she cried from pain that never stopped. Her back would heal eventually into a mass of scars that would mark her forever as someone who had been broken, but the internal damage was worse. On the 2nd day, she began bleeding. On the 3rd day, the bleeding increased. Aunt Bess tried every remedy she knew: herbs to stop bleeding, poultices to reduce fever, prayers to gods who seemed absent. On March 15th, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Clara miscarried. The baby, a girl, fully formed, dead, came out in a rush of blood and tissue that soaked through the blankets. Clara's screams filled the cabin, a sound of physical pain mixed with grief that no words could express. Thomas held the tiny body, perfect in every detail except that his daughter would never breathe, would never open her eyes, would never know her parents loved her. The child's skin was lighter than Thomas's, darker than Clara's, a perfect mixture that represented their hope for the future. Now that hope lay dead in his hands. Aunt Bess wrapped the baby in clean cloth while Thomas held Clara. Clara's voice was broken, raw from screaming. "Our baby. They killed our baby. Edmund killed our baby." "I know," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking for the first time in decades. "I know. Promise me." Clara gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll survive. Promise me you'll live. Promise me you won't do anything that gets you killed." Thomas looked at his wife's destroyed back, at the wrapped bundle that was their murdered child, at the system that had done this and called it property management. Something inside him shifted, a tectonic movement of the soul that changed the entire landscape of his being. But he lied to his wife because she needed the lie. "I promise." Clara smiled weakly, accepting the lie because she was too exhausted to challenge it. "Good. I love you, Thomas. Even if everything is terrible, I love you. I love you too." It was the last completely true thing he would say for a long time. Clara's condition worsened overnight. The whipping had caused internal bleeding that Aunt Bess's remedies could not stop. Infection from the torn flesh entered her bloodstream. By dawn on March 16th, Clara was burning with fever, delirious, calling for her mother who had been sold years ago to a plantation in Tennessee. Thomas sat beside her holding her hand, watching her die by inches. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon on March 16, 1851, Clara opened her eyes with sudden clarity, looked directly at Thomas, and whispered, "Don't let them forget I existed." Then she died. Thomas sat motionless for 10 minutes, holding his dead wife's hand, his face expressionless, his mind fracturing into something new. Aunt Bess eventually touched his shoulder. "She's gone, Thomas. She's free now." "Free?" Thomas repeated the word without inflection. He stood, gently laid Clara's hand across her chest and walked out of the medical cabin. Slaves watched him cross the quarters, noting the emptiness in his eyes, the mechanical precision of his movements. He entered his cabin, closed the door, and stood in the darkness. In that darkness, Thomas died, the man who had survived through submission, who had adapted to slavery by numbing himself to attachment, who had believed patience was wisdom. That man ceased to exist. In his place, something else was born, something that remembered its mother's whispered name, Wanagi, ghost, something that understood patience was not wisdom, but cowardice, something that recognized there were worse things than dying, and living as a slave was one of them. Thomas opened the small wooden box where he kept his few possessions. Inside was the cradle he had carved for his daughter, now a monument to murdered hope. Beneath the cradle was a knife, 6 inches of steel he had stolen from the blacksmith shop months ago and hidden as a general precaution. He had never expected to use it. Now it felt like destiny in his hand. The blade was sharp, well-maintained, capable of cutting through flesh and bone. He placed the knife inside his shirt, the metal cold against his skin. Then he knelt on the dirt floor of his cabin and spoke to gods he was not sure existed. He spoke in fragments of the Osage language his mother had taught him, mixed with English, mixed with rage that transcended language. He promised his wife's spirit that her death would have meaning. He promised his daughter's spirit that her murder would have consequence. He promised his mother's spirit that he would no longer survive through submission. He promised himself that he would become what they feared most, an enslaved man with nothing left to lose. But Thomas was intelligent enough to know that immediate revenge was suicide. If he attacked Master Hartwell or Morrison directly, he would be subdued in seconds and executed publicly as a warning to other slaves. His death would be meaningless, just another example of the system crushing resistance. If he wanted justice, if he wanted revenge that actually mattered, he needed to be methodical, patient, and invisible. He needed to use every skill he had developed over 30 years, not for survival, but for hunting. Thomas's first decision was simple. He would run, but he would not run north toward freedom. He would run into the wetlands, into the dense marshes along the Missouri River where white men feared to go, where Osage and other tribes had lived for thousands of years before removal, where the land itself was a weapon against those unfamiliar with its rhythms. He would disappear into the wetlands and emerge only to kill. He would become a ghost, a shadow, a terror that picked off his enemies one by one until all 4 men responsible for Clara's death were dead, or until they killed him. Either outcome was acceptable. Death held no fear for a man who had already died inside. His second decision was equally calculate. He would choose his targets carefully and kill them in order of increasing danger. The 3 paddy rollers first. They would be sent to track him, which meant they would venture into the wetlands where he had the advantage. Then Morrison, the overseer who had wielded the whip. Then Master Hartwell, the man who had ordered Clara's torture and whose attempted rape had triggered everything. Finally, if he lived that long, he would kill Mistress Hartwell, because her cruelty disguised as righteousness was perhaps the most poisonous element of the entire system. But killing 4 people required planning. It required resources. It required time. Thomas spent the next 2 days moving through Riverside with perfect submission, his mask flawless, his actions beyond suspicion. He attended Clara's burial, a brief ceremony where her body was placed in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery beyond the quarters. He stood silent while Aunt Bess spoke words about heaven and rest and freedom in death. He showed no emotion, made no speeches, offered no grief that masters could witness and potentially punish. During those 2 days, Thomas gathered everything he would need. He stole food slowly. A handful of cornmeal here, some salt pork there, amounts small enough that no one noticed. He collected items from around the plantation, a length of rope from the tool shed, a second knife from the blacksmith shop, flint for starting fires. He wrapped everything in a waterproof oilcloth he had sewn himself from scraps. He hid the bundle in the wetlands at a location only he knew, marked by 3 willow trees growing from a single root base. Most importantly, Thomas studied his enemies with new purpose. He observed the paddy rollers' patterns. They rode in pairs or all 3 together, circling the county every 4 days, passing Riverside's eastern boundary around 10 o'clock at night. He memorized their faces, their horses, their weapons, their habits. Isaac Dawson always rode slightly ahead, eager and aggressive. Benjamin Kirby was the best shot, carrying 2 pistols and a rifle. Samuel Reed, the leader, was methodical and paranoid, always scanning the tree line, always expecting ambush. He studied Morrison's routine. The overseer slept in a small house near the main house, separate from the quarters. He drank heavily every Friday night, a pattern so consistent that drivers planned schedules around his hangovers. He carried a pistol always, but placed it on a table beside his bed when sleeping. He was strong and mean, but not particularly intelligent, relying on fear and violence rather than strategy. Master Hartwell's patterns were equally predictable. He rode to Liberty every Wednesday for business, returning by evening. He kept a small pistol in his jacket pocket but rarely loaded it because he considered slaves too broken to resist. He slept deeply, especially after drinking, which was most nights. His bedroom was on the second floor of the main house, accessible via stairs that creaked on the third and sixth steps. On March 18th, 2 days after Clara's death, Thomas made his move. He worked normally until evening, completed his assigned tasks, ate his evening ration with other slaves, and returned to his cabin. He waited until 11 o'clock at night, after all lights in the main house had been extinguished, after the quarters had gone silent. Then he picked up his hidden bundle from beneath his cabin's floorboards, slipped out the door, and walked steadily toward the tree line. No one stopped him. Slaves sometimes visited the forest edge at night to gather herbs or relieve themselves or simply breathe air that felt slightly less confined. Thomas reached the trees, slipped between trunks, and kept walking. He moved south parallel to the river, his feet finding game trails he had scouted during years of authorized hunting trips. The moon was half full, providing enough light to navigate. After 3 hours of steady walking, Thomas reached the location where he had hidden his supplies. He retrieved the bundle, checked its contents, and continued deeper into the wetlands. By dawn on March 19th, Thomas had disappeared. When slaves reported for morning assignments, Thomas was absent. The driver checked his cabin. Empty. Master Hartwell was notified immediately, and his response was predictable. Another runaway. Send for the paddy rollers. Offer $30 reward. Increase it to $50 if they bring him back alive. I want to make an example. By 9 o'clock that morning, all 3 paddy rollers had gathered at Riverside. They interviewed slaves searching for information about Thomas's possible direction or assistance. The elderly slave woman beside Thomas during Clara's whipping said, "He was grieving, lost his wife and child. Maybe he went into the wetlands to die. Grief kills sometimes." The paddy rollers exchanged glances. The wetlands were dangerous territory, quicksand, water moccasins, impossible terrain for horses. But $50 was significant money, and a runaway slave could not be allowed to simply disappear without consequences. Samuel Reed made the decision. "We go in together. Stay close. Check in at Riverside every 3 days. Be careful. The wetlands have killed better men than us." Isaac Dawson and Benjamin Kirby departed at noon on March 19th, with Reed following shortly after. They rode horses along the river until the terrain became too soft, then continued on foot. They carried rifles, pistols, rope, and 3 days of supplies. They were confident, experienced, and completely unprepared for what Thomas had become. Thomas was 4 miles deep in the wetlands by the time the paddy rollers entered. He had found high ground, a raised area of dry land surrounded by water where willows provided cover and elevation offered visibility. He had built no fire, eaten dried meat cold, and waited with the patience of a predator who understood that rushing meant failure. He knew they would come. He knew they would stay together. He knew they would follow the river because it was the obvious route. And he knew that in the wetlands, where they were visitors and he was resident, the advantage was entirely his. On March 20th, Thomas began hunting the hunters. He moved through the wetlands with the silence his mother had taught him, with the tracking skills he had learned in the lead mines, with the purpose that made him more dangerous than any natural predator. He found their trail easily. 3 men walking on soft ground left obvious signs. He followed them for hours, staying 100 yards behind, invisible in the dense vegetation. That night, Dawson, Kirby, and Reed made camp on a dry hummock, a small island of land in the middle of water. They built a fire, a mistake that announced their position, and ate salt pork and hardtack. They talked loudly, their voices carrying across water. Thomas crouched in darkness 50 yards away, listening, watching, waiting. He had all the time in the world. They had 3 days of supplies, and then they would need to return or resupply. He could wait 3 days. He could wait 3 weeks. He had nothing but time and purpose, but opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. At midnight, Isaac Dawson announced he needed to relieve himself and walked 20 yards into the darkness beyond the firelight. He unbuttoned his pants, urinated against a tree, and was rebuttoning when Thomas emerged from the shadows behind him. Thomas's first kill was efficient and silent. He covered Dawson's mouth with his left hand, jerked the man's head back sharply, and drew his knife across Dawson's throat from left to right in a single smooth motion. The blade severed the carotid artery and jugular vein on both sides, nearly decapitating Dawson. Blood sprayed forward in a pulsing arc, covering tree trunks in arterial spray. Dawson's body went rigid, his hands clawing at his destroyed throat, his legs kicking. Thomas held him for 15 seconds until the movement stopped, then lowered the body silently to the ground. Dawson had carried 2 pistols, a rifle, ammunition, and a knife. Thomas took everything, adding them to his arsenal. He dragged the body deeper into the wetlands 30 yards from the camp and left it partially submerged in shallow water where alligators would find it by morning. Then he returned to watching Kirby and Reed. Kirby waited 5 minutes, then 10, then 15. He called out, "Dawson, you fall in a gator hole?" No response. Kirby stood, picked up his rifle, and walked toward the tree line where Dawson had gone. "Dawson, this isn't funny. Answer me." Thomas allowed Kirby to find the blood. The paddy roller's lantern illuminated arterial spray painting multiple tree trunks, massive amounts of blood soaking into mud and leaves, clear evidence of catastrophic injury. Kirby's face went pale. "Jesus Christ, Dawson!" He spun in circles, rifle raised, searching darkness for threats. "Dawson, where are you?" Kirby backed toward the campfire, his movements panicked now, all confidence evaporated. He reached the fire and began throwing supplies into his pack, abandoning the search, planning to run back to Riverside for reinforcements. He never saw Thomas emerge from the darkness behind him. Thomas's second kill was not efficient. It was personal. He grabbed Kirby from behind, one arm around the man's throat in a chokehold, the other hand gripping Kirby's rifle to prevent him from aiming it. Kirby struggled, tried to scream, couldn't breathe enough to make sound. Thomas squeezed harder, cutting off blood flow to Kirby's brain. After 30 seconds, Kirby went limp. Thomas dragged Kirby's unconscious body away from the fire to a location where a fallen log created a natural bench. He propped Kirby against the tree, used rope to bind his hands and feet, and waited for him to wake up. It took 5 minutes. When Kirby opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was Thomas's face, expressionless and blood-spattered, illuminated by moonlight. Kirby's voice cracked with terror. "Please don't kill me. I got money, I got a farm, I was just doing my job. Please." "Doing your job." Thomas's voice was calm, almost conversational. "That's what the overseer said. Just doing his job when he whipped my wife 40 times. Just doing his job when he killed my daughter. Just doing his job. I didn't kill your wife. You hunted runaways. You whipped people for having no pass. You shot a man in the back last year when he tried to reach his family in Kansas, I remember. Everyone remembers. You smiled when you shot him." Kirby's face was sheet white. That was different. He was running. He was trying to be free. Thomas leaned closer. "You know what freedom feels like?" "No. You were born free. You take it for granted. I was born property. My wife was property. My daughter was property before she even breathed. And you helped maintain the system that made us property. You profited from our suffering. $3 per captured runaway. Blood money. I'm sorry, please." Thomas placed his knife against Kirby's throat. "My wife begged too. Didn't matter. She died anyway. You want mercy? There is no mercy. Not anymore." He drew the blade across Kirby's throat, a precise cut that severed everything important. Blood poured from the wound, soaking Kirby's shirt, his body convulsing as death came slowly, painfully. Thomas watched without expression until the movement stopped. 2 paddy rollers dead in one night. Samuel Reed, sleeping near the fire, woke to silence. He sat up, rifle in hand, scanning the darkness. "Dawson? Kirby?" No response. Reed stood slowly, his every instinct screaming danger. He kicked dirt over the fire, extinguishing it, plunging the camp into darkness. Then he moved into the wetlands, abandoning his supplies, running blindly through darkness toward Riverside. Thomas let him go. Reed was the leader, the most dangerous, the one who would organize a massive response. But he was also terrified now, and terror would spread faster than Thomas could kill. Thomas took the paddy roller's supplies, food, ammunition, 2 more rifles, and disappeared into the wetlands. He did not return to their camp. He found another elevated area 3 miles west and built a concealed shelter using fallen logs and moss. He ate, slept for 4 hours, and woke before dawn to continue hunting. Samuel Reed reached Riverside at dawn on March 21st, exhausted, terrified, babbling about an ambush in the wetlands. Master Hartwell listened to his account, his face darkening with each detail. 2 men dead? Hartwell's voice was cold. And you ran? We were ambushed, Reed protested. Dawson and Kirby are dead. This Thomas, he's not running. He's hunting. We need more men. You need to go back, Hartwell interrupted. Take Morrison. Take 5 more men. Find this Thomas and kill him. I'll pay $100 to whoever brings me his head. Reed wanted to refuse, but $100 was a fortune. He nodded slowly. On March 22nd, Morrison and Reed, along with 5 hired men, entered the wetlands. They were better armed, more cautious, moving in a tight group. Thomas watched them from concealment, counting men, assessing weapons, calculating odds. 7 men, all armed, all alert. Direct confrontation was suicide. He needed to separate them, pick them off individually, use the terrain against them. Thomas spent 2 days shadowing the search party, observing their patterns. They moved slowly, checking every elevated area, searching for signs. Morrison led from the front, his confidence unshaken. Reed followed close behind, visibly nervous. The 5 hired men stayed together, whispering among themselves, clearly uncomfortable. On March 24th, Thomas made his move on Morrison. The overseer had separated from the group to investigate a sound, probably an animal, but Morrison was too aggressive to ignore potential threats. He walked 20 yards from the others, rifle ready, scanning the undergrowth. Thomas was perched in a willow tree directly above Morrison's path, invisible among the branches. When Morrison passed beneath, Thomas dropped silently onto his back, his knife already in motion. The blade went into Morrison's back just left of the spine, angled upward to pierce the heart. Morrison gasped, his body going rigid. Thomas twisted the knife and pulled it free, then cut Morrison's throat as the man fell forward. The other men heard the sound and rushed forward, but Thomas had already melted back into the wetlands, moving silently through water and undergrowth. They found Morrison's body, his back destroyed, his throat cut, lying face down in mud. Reed stared at the corpse, his face pale. We need to leave now, this Thomas. He's not human, he's a demon. The 5 hired men needed no convincing. They abandoned the search and ran toward Riverside, leaving Reed and Morrison's body behind. Reed followed, his courage finally broken completely. 3 men dead, 1 remaining. Thomas returned to his shelter and waited. He knew what would happen next. Hartwell would panic. Hartwell would fortify Riverside. Hartwell would hire more men, post guards, make himself unreachable. But Hartwell would also need to maintain his business. He would need to travel to Liberty. He would need to move outside the protection of his estate. And when he did, Thomas would be waiting. For 5 days, nothing happened. Hartwell remained at Riverside, surrounded by armed guards. He hired 10 men to patrol the property constantly. He offered $200 for Thomas's capture, dead or alive. But on March 29th, Hartwell made a mistake. He had a scheduled meeting in Liberty with his banker, a meeting he couldn't postpone without risking financial ruin. He decided to risk the journey, taking 4 armed guards in a closed carriage. Thomas had been watching Riverside from the forest edge for days, observing patterns, counting guards, noting who came and went. When he saw the carriage depart with Hartwell inside, he moved quickly. He knew the road to Liberty. He knew every curve, every elevation change, every location suitable for ambush. He chose his spot carefully, 3 miles from Riverside, where the road passed through dense forest and curved sharply around a steep embankment. Trees grew close on both sides, creating a natural choke point. Thomas positioned himself on the high side of the embankment, 15 feet above the road, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes. He had 3 rifles now, all loaded and primed. He had 4 pistols. He had his knife. He had the absolute certainty that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. The carriage appeared at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The driver slowed to navigate the curve. The 4 guards rode 2 in front, 2 behind, their rifles held loosely because they had ridden this route without incident dozens of times. Thomas aimed at the lead guard and fired. The guard fell from his horse, shot through the chest. Thomas dropped the first rifle, picked up the second, aimed at the second guard, fired. The man jerked backward and tumbled from his saddle. The 2 rear guards spurred their horses forward, trying to reach the cover of the carriage. Thomas shot the 3rd guard in the back. The 4th guard raised his rifle to return fire, but Thomas's 4th shot hit him in the shoulder, spinning him around and knocking him from his horse. The entire ambush had taken 20 seconds. 4 guards down, none dead yet except possibly the 1st. The carriage driver whipped the horses, trying to speed away. Thomas aimed carefully and shot the left horse, a cruel but necessary tactic. The animal screamed and collapsed, tangling in its harness and pulling the right horse down with it. The carriage tipped sideways, slamming into the embankment. Thomas heard a crash from inside as Master Hartwell was thrown around the interior. Thomas descended the embankment in 3 quick strides. The wounded guards were trying to reload or retrieve weapons. Thomas shot the 1st guard who was still moving, then the 2nd. He approached the overturned carriage and tore open the door. Master Hartwell lay inside, his face bleeding from a gash above his eye, his right arm bent at an unnatural angle. He looked up and saw Thomas's face, and his expression transformed from pain to pure terror. "Please don't kill me," Hartwell gasped. "I'll free you. I'll sign papers. You can go north. I'll give you money, please." Thomas reached in, grabbed Hartwell by his broken arm, and dragged him from the carriage. Hartwell screamed from pain. Thomas dropped him in the dirt road, knelt beside him, and placed his knife against Hartwell's throat. "You ordered my wife's torture." Thomas's voice was conversational. "Did she beg you for mercy? Did she beg you not to order her whipping? Did she beg you not to rape her?" "I didn't rape her. You tried. And when she resisted, your wife ordered her torture. You allowed it, you watched it, you approved it. You killed her and my daughter as surely as if you had held the whip yourself." Hartwell tried to crawl away. Thomas grabbed him by the hair and jerked his head back, exposing his throat completely. "I'm property," you said. "My wife was property. My daughter was property. Well, property just killed you." He drew the knife across Hartwell's throat with deliberate slowness, sawing through flesh and windpipe and arteries until blood sprayed in pulsing jets. Hartwell's hands clawed at his destroyed throat. His legs kicked, his body convulsed. Thomas held him down and watched him die, feeling nothing except a distant satisfaction that justice had finally arrived. When Hartwell's body stopped moving, Thomas stood and surveyed the scene. 5 men dead on a county road. This would provoke massive response. Authorities would mobilize every available man. Slave owners would panic. The entire system would mobilize to crush the threat Thomas represented. But Thomas had accomplished his primary goal. Hartwell was dead. Clara was avenged. One target remained: Mistress Hartwell. Thomas considered letting her live. She had not wielded the whip herself, but she had ordered Clara's torture and watched without mercy. She represented the particular cruelty of white women who channeled their own oppression into violence against enslaved women. She would die too. Thomas vanished into the forest before authorities discovered the massacre. He moved deep into the wetlands, knowing every tracker in Missouri would hunt him now with every resource available. For 2 days, Thomas stayed hidden, eating sparingly, sleeping in short intervals, moving constantly to avoid establishing patterns that could be predicted. On March 31st, authorities made their move. They organized a line of 20 armed men to sweep through the wetlands from north to south, driving any fugitive toward the open fields, where horses and numbers would provide decisive advantage. The sweep began at dawn. 20 men entered the wetlands in a line, each man 10 yards from his neighbor, all moving south toward the river. They fired rifles periodically to scare any hiding fugitive into movement. Thomas heard them coming hours before they reached his position. He abandoned his shelter and moved south ahead of the line, staying just out of sight, using every trick he knew to avoid leaving clear trails. But he was being compressed into increasingly limited terrain. By midday, he had been pushed to within a quarter-mile of the wetland's southern edge, beyond which lay open ground. Thomas understood the trap. If he left the wetlands, he would be exposed and easily killed. If he stayed, he would eventually be cornered. He needed to break the line of searchers and escape north back into the deep wetlands. That meant attacking directly, killing enough men to create a gap, and running through before they could reorganize. He chose his position carefully, a thick stand of willows surrounded by waist-deep water. He could see the line of searchers approaching through the trees. They were bunched together in some places, spread thin in others, maintaining their cordon but not perfectly. Thomas identified a gap where two searchers were separated by 15 yards instead of 10, and he positioned himself to exploit that gap. When the line reached his position, Thomas emerged from cover and opened fire. He shot the nearest searcher in the chest, dropped the rifle, pulled a pistol, and shot the second searcher in the face. He drew a second pistol and shot at the men to his left, forcing them to dive for cover. Then he ran directly at the gap, charging through waist-deep water with incredible speed. The searchers returned fire, bullets tearing through leaves and splashing water around Thomas, but he was moving too fast and erratically for accurate aim. He reached the gap, scrambled up a muddy bank, and disappeared into dense vegetation before the shocked searchers could coordinate a response. By the time they reorganized and reached his escape route, Thomas was 300 yards away and moving fast. But Thomas had been hit. A bullet had grazed his left side, tearing through skin and muscle without hitting anything vital. The wound bled freely, soaking his shirt, leaving a blood trail even a novice tracker could follow. Thomas knew he was compromised. He couldn't outrun them with an injury. He couldn't hide with a blood trail. He had perhaps 2 hours before they caught him. He changed tactics. Instead of running deeper into the wetlands, he circled back toward Riverside. They would expect him to run away, not toward danger. It was insane, which meant it might work. Thomas reached the edge of Riverside's property at dusk on March 31st. He was exhausted, bleeding, feverish from infection. But he had one more target, and he would not die until she was dead. He waited until full darkness, then infiltrated Riverside's grounds, moving through shadows toward the main house. Guards patrolled constantly, but they were watching the forest, not the house itself. Thomas reached a window he had deliberately damaged weeks earlier during a repair job, pried it open silently and climbed inside. He moved through the dark house with absolute silence, his bare feet finding floorboards that didn't creak, his body casting no shadow. He reached Mistress Hartwell's bedroom door. No guards. They were all outside watching for external threats. Thomas opened the door and entered. Mistress Hartwell lay asleep in her bed, a silk sleeping gown making her look vulnerable and innocent, which she absolutely was not. Thomas approached silently and placed his hand over her mouth, waking her with the pressure. Her eyes snapped open wide with terror. Thomas held his knife where she could see it, then leaned close and whispered directly into her ear, "Your husband is dead. Morrison is dead. The patty rollers are dead. Everyone who killed my wife is dead or dying. You ordered her torture. You watched her suffer. You felt no mercy. Now you feel terror, and you know you deserve it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Beg for mercy like she did. See if I care." Mistress Hartwell tried to scream, but Thomas's hand muffled the sound. Her eyes were wide with pure animal terror, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking. Thomas looked into her eyes and saw the same lack of empathy she had shown Clara. He felt no satisfaction, no joy, no triumph, only a cold completion of necessary work. He removed his hand from her mouth just long enough for her to draw breath to scream, then cut her throat before she could make sound. Blood sprayed across silk sheets and expensive pillows. Mistress Hartwell's hands clawed at her throat, her legs kicking beneath covers, her body convulsing as death came slowly. Thomas watched without expression until she stopped moving. 4 people dead. His mission complete. Thomas left the main house the way he had entered, disappearing into darkness before anyone discovered the body. He knew his wound was mortal. Infection and blood loss would kill him within days, even if they didn't catch him first. But he had accomplished his mission. Everyone directly responsible for Clara's death was dead. He had made them afraid. He had proven that enslaved people could fight back, could inflict consequences for cruelty. Thomas walked back toward the wetlands, his steps becoming unsteady, his vision blurring. He reached the river's edge as dawn broke on April 1st, 1851. Behind him, he heard shouting. Guards had discovered Mistress Hartwell's body. Ahead of him, the Missouri River flowed broad and dark, current strong from spring rains. Thomas looked at the river, at the pursuing men, at the burning fever in his blood. He thought of Clara, of his daughter, of his mother, of everyone he had loved and lost. He thought about 30 years of slavery, followed by 2 weeks of freedom bought with blood. Thomas waded into the river. The current was strong, the water cold. He swam toward the opposite bank, his strength fading with each stroke. Behind him, guards reached the riverbank and began shooting. Bullets churned the water around him. Thomas dove underwater, his lungs burning. He surfaced once more in the middle of the river, gasped for air, and saw the guards reloading on the distant bank. He dove again, the current carrying him downstream, away from Riverside, away from everything. Thomas never surfaced again. His body was never found. Some said it washed up miles downriver and was consumed by animals. Some said he somehow survived and escaped north. Some said his spirit remained in the wetlands, protecting runaways and tormenting slave catchers. The truth was simpler and more final. Thomas died in the river, where his blood mixed with water, his body carried away by currents, his physical existence erased as thoroughly as slavery had tried to erase his humanity. But his story could not be erased. The news of Ghost's rampage spread across Missouri and neighboring states faster than any actual ghost could travel. Plantation owners from Illinois to Arkansas heard about the slave who had killed at least 8 people, including a master, an overseer, 3 paddy rollers, and a mistress, and disappeared into legend. The reaction among white slaveholders was predictable panic. They increased security, hired more overseers, formed larger patrols, implemented harsher punishments. They enacted new laws, increased rewards for captured runaways to $150. The paranoia was so intense that some plantation owners moved their families to cities and hired armed guards to sleep outside their bedrooms. But the reaction among enslaved people was different and profound. In slave quarters across Missouri and beyond, ghost story was told and retold, embellished and mythologized, transformed into something larger than one man's revenge. Spirituals were composed with coded lyrics celebrating the ghost who hunted hunters. Children born that year were secretly named variations of ghost, wanagi, phantom, shadow, names that masters never heard but that connected new generations to the legacy of resistance. In Clay County specifically, Riverside Estate effectively ceased functioning. Hartwell's heirs sold the property at a massive loss, and the new owner found it nearly impossible to maintain control. Slaves worked slowly, tools disappeared, fires started mysteriously. Within 3 years, the plantation was abandoned, hemp fields returning to wilderness, the main house becoming a ruin. The 3 paddy rollers who died hunting ghost were not replaced. Clay County struggled to find men willing to patrol slave roads, even at increased pay. The breakdown of the patrol system meant more successful escapes. The lasting impact of Ghost's resistance extended far beyond Missouri. His story joined the constellation of resistance narratives that sustained enslaved people's will to fight. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts, using it as evidence that slavery was morally unsustainable. The historical record of Thomas called Ghost is sparse and contradictory. No photograph exists. Court records mention the killings but provide few details about the killer. Plantation records from Riverside listed a slave named Thomas, purchased in 1843, valued at $700, who absconded on March 19, 1851. But oral tradition preserved what written records erased. In African American communities descended from Missouri slaves, the story of Ghost survived through generations. The core truth remained constant. A man lost everything, fought back with everything he had, and died free rather than live enslaved. This is the story of the Missouri ghost who killed at least 8 people and vanished into legend. It is a true story, though the details have been reconstructed from fragmentary records and oral traditions. It is a disturbing story that challenges our comfortable narratives about American history. It is an important story that preserves the memory of people who fought back when fighting back meant death. Remember Thomas. Remember Clara. Remember their daughter who never breathed. Remember all of them, not to celebrate violence but to understand its roots in systemic injustice. Remember all of them so that we can build a world where such stories cannot happen again. The wetlands of Missouri are silent now. The ghost is gone, but his presence echoes still across more than a century and a half, reminding us that resistance is possible, that oppression has consequences, and that the human spirit can be broken or killed but never truly conquered as long as even one person refuses to submit. That refusal is Thomas's legacy. That refusal is what we must carry forward. That refusal is why his story matters and why it will continue to matter as long as injustice exists, and people of conscience must decide whether to accept it or fight back. O Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.